Imagine discovering the fundamental building block of the universe. Imagine winning the Nobel Prize for proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it is a solid particle. And then, imagine living 30 years longer, only to watch your own son win the exact same Nobel Prize for proving you entirely wrong. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are drawn to the hidden dramas behind history's greatest minds, the bitter rivalries, and the tragic accidents that shape our reality, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. This is the ultimate generational plot twist, wrapped inside one of the most chaotic, fiercely competitive periods in all of human knowledge. The brutal transition from classical physics to quantum mechanics. It was not just a shift in equations on a chalkboard. It was a fundamental shift in how we understand reality itself, and the architect of that massive shift was Joseph John Thomson. J. Thomson. He was the man who literally shattered a 2,000-year-old assumption, the bedrock belief that the atom was this absolute, indivisible unit of reality. To understand the magnitude of his triumph and how he managed to physically break the atom, we must delve into a massive repository of historical sources. The biographical archives from Cambridge University, academic historical texts tracking the bloody evolution of 19th century atomic theory, original physics journals from the 1890s, and Thomson's own 1906 Nobel lecture, where he was forced to justify his findings to a super-skeptical scientific establishment. The historical record proves that true genius rarely looks or acts the way we expect. That dissonance between expectation and reality defines Thomson's entire life. Even his origins run completely counter to the image of the elite, cloistered Cambridge academic. He was born on December 18, 1856, in Cheetham Hill, a suburb of Manchester, England. Mid-19th century Manchester was the roaring, soot-choked engine room of the Industrial Revolution. It was a deafening landscape of textile mills, heavy machinery, and endless coal smoke. The absolute epicenter of practical, applied human endeavor. His immediate family wasn't working the looms or shoveling coal. His father, Joseph James Thomson, ran an antiquarian bookshop focusing on rare and historical texts, a specialist business that had been in the family for generations. His mother, Emma Swindles, came from a local family in the textile trade, rendering them comfortably middle class. Young JJ fostered an innate curiosity among those dusty, obscure books, but his father made a very pragmatic calculation while looking out at the mechanized landscape of Manchester. He decided his son's future shouldn't be in books, but in the practical application of the modern age. He wanted JJ to be a locomotive engineer. In the 1870s, locomotive manufacturing was the bleeding edge of global technology. Trains literally drove the British Empire. The family rigidly set the plan and arranged a highly prestigious apprenticeship for him at Sharp Stewart & Company, the firm that built the massive iron beasts powering the Victorian era. But there was a catch. The firm had a waiting list for apprentices and couldn't take him immediately. To keep the boy prepared and occupied, his father enrolled him at Owens College in Manchester. JJ was only 14 years old. He had to navigate a university campus, sitting in rigid Victorian lecture halls, alongside grown men with facial hair and serious academic careers. It was a massive scandal. The historical archives reveal that immediately after his admission, the perturbed authorities at Owens College changed the bylaws, raising the minimum admission age to 16 specifically to prevent another catastrophe of a 14-year-old boy wandering their halls. Yet, Owens College possessed an incredibly robust science program for its time, abruptly exposing the young boy to experimental physics. Then, the narrative takes a devastatingly dark turn. When JJ was exactly 16, the exact age he would theoretically be gearing up to finally begin his locomotive apprenticeship, a literal catastrophe struck. his father suddenly died. For a 16-year-old, it was a massive emotional blow. But in the context of 1870s British society, the loss of the patriarch was an immediate financial crisis. To secure a top-tier apprenticeship at an engineering firm, families had to pay an exorbitant upfront fee called a premium. With his father gone and the bookshop's revenues utterly uncertain, Emma Swindles was left to manage the fallout. The family simply could not afford the premium anymore. It was a brutal reality check. The dream of building the great machines of the empire evaporated overnight because the check wouldn't clear. The historical butterfly effect here is staggering. Financially locked out of applied, hands-on engineering, Thomson had to find a way to survive academically. He realized he could stay at Owens College and advance his education only if he secured academic scholarships. The available scholarships weren't for practical engineering. They were for pure mathematics and theoretical physics. The man who would eventually physically dismantle the atom only pivoted to pure theoretical science out of sheer financial desperation. The constraints completely dictated his path, but his mind happened to be perfectly suited for those exact constraints. He leaned entirely into his mathematical talent, and by 1876, his absolute proficiency earned him a minor scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. If Owens College was an introduction, Cambridge was the absolute crucible of abstract mathematics. Thomson spent years rigorously preparing for the mathematical tripos, the final, grueling examination for math students at Cambridge. In 1880, this was not a simple multiple-choice test. It was a literal marathon, an endurance event masquerading as an academic exam. Students sat for hours upon hours, day after day, in freezing cold halls, solving incredibly complex abstract mathematical problems. It tested not just intellect, but sheer physical and mental stamina. The top scorers were given the prestigious title of Wranglers. J. Thomson graduated as the second Wrangler, meaning he held the second highest score in the entire university. He had definitively proven himself as an absolute mathematical prodigy, capable of manipulating abstract equations better than almost anyone in Europe. But math is done on paper, in the abstract. Physics, especially the kind of physical boundary pushing that was about to happen, requires you to actually build, manipulate, and test things in the real, tangible world. This exact tension between the brilliant abstract mind and the messy physical reality of a laboratory sets the stage for arguably the most controversial academic appointment in British history. Fast forward to 1884. The Cavendish Professorship of Experimental Physics at Cambridge opens up. The Cavendish was not just some random lab. It was the Mount Olympus of 19th century science, the premier experimental physics laboratory in the world. The previous two chairs were absolute titans. James Clerk Maxwell, the god of physics who mathematically unified electricity and magnetism, and Lord Rayleigh, famous for his obsessive, flawless precision, a man who spent years refining equipment just to measure the electrical resistance of a specific wire to the 5th decimal place. When Rayleigh stepped down, the scientific establishment assumed the electors would choose another seasoned, gray-haired experimentalist with decades of laboratory precision. Instead, they chose J. Thomson, a 28-year-old mathematician. The academic journals were outraged. They had handed the keys to the most important laboratory on Earth to a guy in his 20s whose primary skill was winning a math competition. One prominent physicist bitterly remarked that things had come to a pretty pass at Cambridge when they elected a mere boy to the professorship. But it wasn't just his age that offended them. It was his notorious, almost comical clumsiness. The man running the top experimental lab on Earth was a physical klutz, a literal menace to laboratory glassware. Cavendish archives are full of letters and diary entries from his assistants detailing how they actively tried to keep him away from fragile glass instruments. If Thomson physically touched an experiment, there was a remarkably high probability it would end up in pieces on the floor. He couldn't blow glass, he couldn't solder wires effectively, and he couldn't operate delicate vacuum pumps without breaking the seals. Why on earth would the Cambridge electors put him in charge? It looked absurd on the surface, an insult to the technicians doing the physical labor. Yet, the electors were demonstrating profound foresight. They realized physics had hit a temporary wall. Rayleigh had already perfected precise measurement. The discipline didn't just need another bricklayer meticulously measuring bricks. It needed an architect. The next great leaps in physics would involve entirely invisible phenomena. To explore the invisible, you needed someone who could build vast mathematical frameworks to conceptualize what couldn't be seen. Thomson had an absolute genius for designing apparatuses and diagnosing theoretical problems, even if his ham-fisted hands couldn't actually build them. This perceived flaw became the catalyst for a cultural revolution. Because he knew he couldn't rely on his own hands, Thomson couldn't lock himself away to tinker alone like so many Victorian gentleman scientists. He was entirely dependent on highly skilled assistants. He had to learn to communicate highly abstract theories to the men actually firing up the blowtorches and pulling the vacuums. This forced dependency created a deeply collaborative environment, transforming potential disaster into absolute magic. And that collaborative machinery was completely necessary because Thomson was about to walk straight into the biggest, most aggressive scientific heavyweight bout of the 1890s. The scientific heavyweight bout of the 1890s was known simply as the Battle of the Rays. It was a fierce ideological war that split the European physics community right down the middle, largely along national lines. By the late 19th century, as glassblowing and vacuum pump technologies improved, physicists began experimenting with a mysterious device known as a Crookes tube. If you take a glass tube, pump almost all the air out of it to create a strong vacuum, seal it, and run a high-voltage electrical current through the electrodes at each end, something ghostly happens. A glowing, ghostly green beam shoots from the negative end, the cathode, to the positive end. Hence the name, cathode rays. Nobody knew what this glowing green beam actually was. The German School of Physics, led by absolute scientific heavyweights like Heinrich Hertz and Philipp Lenard, firmly believed that these rays were an ethereal vibration, a wave in the ether, much like light, but the opposing camp. The British and French physicists, including William Crookes and J.J. Thomson, argued that the rays were not waves of energy at all. They argued the beam was a stream of actual physical electrified particles, tiny bullets of matter shooting across the vacuum. Waves versus particles. It is the classic physics showdown. But if you are J.J. Thomson, sitting in the Cavendish with your brilliant assistants and your desperately clumsy hands, how do you actually prove your particle theory to a German scientific establishment convinced that you are fundamentally wrong? You do it through a meticulously designed series of 3 breakthrough experiments in 1897. Step 1. He had to definitively prove the rays carried an electric charge, independent of the physical cathode itself. Thomson and his team essentially built a metal trap inside the vacuum tube. He directed the glowing beam into a small metal cylinder connected to an electrometer. The moment the rays hit the cylinder, the electrometer registered a massive negative charge. The beam was bringing negative electricity with it, but proving it carried a charge wasn't enough to defeat the German wave theory. The Germans had a massive piece of counter-evidence. If the beam was made of negatively charged particles, it should obey the basic laws of electromagnetism. Because like repels, like and opposites attract, a negative beam should be pulled toward a positive electric plate. Heinrich Hertz, one of the greatest experimentalists alive, had specifically tried to bend the cathode rays using an electric field. He put electrically charged metal plates on either side of the glass tube, turned them on, and the green beam didn't move a single millimeter. It shot straight through. Hertz naturally concluded that because the beam completely ignored the electric field, it could not possibly be composed of charged particles. This is where Thomson's staggering genius as an experimental architect truly shines. He looked at Hertz's failure and realized the flaw wasn't in the theoretical concept. The flaw was in the vacuum. Thomson deduced that Hertz's vacuum pumps simply weren't strong enough. There was still a tiny bit of residual air left inside Hertz's glass tube. When those high-speed cathode rays shot through the residual gas, they violently collided with the gas molecules, knocking pieces off and turning them into charged ions. Suddenly, the space inside the tube wasn't empty. It was filled with a swarm of positive and negative ions. This swarm acted as an invisible conductive shield clustering around the cathode ray beam. When Hertz turned on his positively charged electric plate, the electric force was instantly neutralized by the swarm. The electric field never actually penetrated the swarm to reach the cathode rays inside. The beam was wearing invisible armor. Thomson realized the tool itself was masking reality. His solution was brutal but elegant: pump out more air. Achieving that extreme vacuum in 1897 was a monumental physical task. His assistants literally had to bake the glass tubes to drive out moisture, and they ran mechanical vacuum pumps exhaustively for days on end to pull out every possible molecule of gas, achieving a vacuum far superior to anything Hertz had ever managed. Once that ultra-high vacuum was achieved and the masking gas was entirely gone, Thomson flipped the switch on the electric plates, and then the glowing green beam sharply deflected toward the positive plate. The invisible armor was gone. The beam bent. Particles had won, and the Germans were forced to concede. But knowing something is a physical particle doesn't tell you what that particle actually is. That leads directly to step 3, the experiment that literally changed the course of human history. Thomson needed to measure these particles, but they were unimaginably small and moving incredibly fast. So, he designed a tube that subjected the beam to a literal tug-of-war, an electric field pulling it up, and a magnetic field pushing it down. By incredibly careful manipulation of the voltage and the magnets, Thomson's team balanced the two opposing forces perfectly. They tweaked the dials until the beam shot straight through, completely undisturbed, because the upward pull exactly equaled the downward push. This is where abstract mathematics overtook physical reality. The force exerted by an electric field depends purely on the particle's charge, but the force exerted by a magnetic field depends on both the particle's charge and its velocity. Because he had balanced the two forces, Thomson could set the two equations equal to each other, allowing the charge to cancel out of the equation entirely. By knowing the strength of his magnets and plates, he calculated the exact velocity of the particles, roughly 1/10 the speed of light, astonishingly fast. Once he had the velocity, he turned off the electric field, let the magnetic field bend the beam, measured the angle of that deflection, and calculated the vital metric, the charge-to-mass ratio. He didn't know the exact mass, and he didn't know the exact charge, but he knew the ratio between them. And what that ratio revealed shattered a 2,000-year-old understanding of the universe. The ratio was enormous. And the only way a charge-to-mass ratio can be that enormous is if the mass itself is unbelievably tiny. Thomson compared his ratio to the ratio of a hydrogen ion. At that time, John Dalton's atomic theory was the bedrock of all 19th century chemistry, stating unequivocally that atoms were the absolute smallest, indivisible, rock-bottom units of matter. Nothing could possibly be smaller than a hydrogen atom, but Thomson's calculations showed that these cathode ray particles were roughly 1,000 times lighter than the hydrogen atom. He had discovered a subatomic particle, and he noticed something even more profound. He repeated the experiment obsessively. He changed the gas inside the tube. He changed the metal used for the cathode, using aluminum, platinum, and iron. It didn't matter. The glowing beam always produced particles with the exact same mass and the exact same charge. The historical implication was staggering. These particles were not specific to a certain metal or gas. They were a universal, fundamental component of all matter. Thomson originally called them corpuscles, arguing that all atoms were built out of these tiny, identical, negatively charged units. The scientific community later universally adopted the term electrons, a word coined a few years earlier by the physicist George Stoney. Imagine a massive Lego castle that all the world's scientists firmly believed was carved out of a single, solid block of stone. Thomson managed to chip a tiny piece off, proving the castle was actually built out of millions of tiny, interchangeable, universal bricks. But chipping that block off created a massive logical crisis, the crisis of neutrality. A standard atom of any element is electrically neutral. It has zero net charge. If you violently rip a negatively charged piece out of that neutral atom, the math of the universe no longer balances. There must be something positively charged left behind to balance the books. Thomson, ever the theoretician, felt compelled to provide a mechanical explanation for how a neutral atom could contain these negative electrons. In 1904, he proposed what became famously, and somewhat unfortunately, known as the plum pudding model of the atom. He envisioned the atom as a uniform, continuous sphere of positively charged matter. This sphere of positive charge was the pudding, the dough itself, a diffuse cloud or jelly of positivity. Embedded throughout this diffuse positive jelly were the negative electrons, scattered like little raisins inside the cake. The positive jelly essentially acted as glue to hold the negative electrons in place. If an electron moved too far toward the outer edge, the bulk of the positive charge pulling from the center would drag it back inward, creating a stable, mechanically balanced atom. For several years, this plum pudding model was the working theory of reality, until his own student spectacularly tore it to shreds. Enter Ernest Rutherford. He was a booming, brilliant, larger-than-life physicist from New Zealand who arrived at the Cavendish lab as a research student to work directly under Thomson. Rutherford eventually moved to the University of Manchester, and in 1911, he and his team initiated the famous gold foil experiment, the very experiment that gives us the atom as we picture it today. Rutherford's team took a radioactive source emitting alpha particles, heavy, fast-moving, positively charged projectiles, and fired a beam of them at a sheet of gold foil hammered so incredibly thin it was only a few atoms thick. If Thomson's plum pudding model was correct and the atom was just a soft, uniform jelly of diffuse positive charge, the heavy alpha bullets should have blasted straight through the gold foil with almost no resistance. It would be like firing a high-speed rifle bullet through a cloud of mist, or through pudding. The diffuse charge shouldn't be dense enough to stop them, and indeed the vast majority of the alpha particles did pass straight through, but not all of them. A tiny fraction, about 1 in 20,000, were deflected at extreme angles. Some of them even bounced straight back toward the radioactive source. Physically, this meant they didn't hit a cloud of jelly. They hit an absolute brick wall. Rutherford famously described his utter shock by saying it was as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch naval artillery shell at a piece of tissue paper, and the shell bounced back and hit you. The math was undeniable. The bouncing alpha particles proved conclusively that the positive charge was not a diffuse, soft pudding. All of the positive charge, and almost all of the mass, was concentrated into an infinitesimally small, unimaginably dense center point. The nucleus. Rutherford had discovered the nuclear atom, proving that most of the atom was actually completely empty space, with electrons orbiting far away from the dense center. In making this monumental discovery, Rutherford completely and utterly disproved his mentor's plum pudding model. How does a scientific titan react when his life's work is demolished by the very student he trained? We all know what academic egos are like, especially in elite university settings, and especially in the early 20th century. When a young, upstart student completely demolishes the defining theory of the most famous physicist in England, one might expect that titan to pull rank. Did Thomson try to bury Rutherford's research? Did he try to aggressively protect his legacy? The historical record shows the exact opposite, and this reveals the true core of Thomson's genius. Rather than being defensive or bitter, Thomson was fascinated. He didn't exile Rutherford, he championed him. Thomson understood that science is an iterative process, and his greatness wasn't merely in his own intellect. It was in his unparalleled ability to nurture and accelerate genius in others. Under his leadership, the Cavendish Laboratory transformed into what historians essentially call a Nobel factory. How did a clumsy theoretician, heavily reliant on his assistants, build a factory for the world's highest scientific honor? It wasn't through massive funding. The Cavendish famously ran on a shoestring budget. The researchers had a running joke that the lab survived on string and sealing wax, requiring them to be incredibly inventive just to keep the glass tubes from leaking. The magic was entirely in the culture Thomson architected. Every single afternoon, without fail, Thomson would leave his office and make the rounds. He visited every single researcher in the lab, from the senior scientists down to the newest students. He asked probing questions. He poked holes in their working theories. He offered brilliant mathematical workarounds for their mechanical problems. He acted as a massive intellectual sounding board for the entire building, fostering an environment of fearless, lively debate. There was no rigid hierarchy when it came to physics. If a student had a better idea, Thomson wanted to hear it. He even instituted daily afternoon tea, physically forcing the researchers to stop working, gather together, and talk across disciplines. The results of this culture are absolutely staggering. 7 of Thomson's research assistants and students went on to win Nobel Prizes in physics or chemistry. Ernest Rutherford, Charles Thomson, Reese Wilson, Francis Aston, William Henry Bragg, Max Born, Niels Bohr. The list is a literal who's who of the quantum revolution. Thomson didn't just discover the electron. He discovered, shaped, and mentored the minds that would go on to build the entirety of modern physics. It is like looking at the coaching tree of the greatest sports dynasty in history. Every major breakthrough in early 20th century physics has roots leading directly back to J.J. Thomson's messy, underfunded, string and sealing wax laboratory. But Thomson did not simply retire into a purely administrative role after his student proved him wrong. He wasn't done exploring the vacuum tubes. After the electron was established and the plum pudding model was retired, he turned his intense focus entirely toward the positive charges. If cathode rays were the negative pieces shooting one way, he wanted to look at what was shooting the other way. He started examining canal rays, streams of positively charged ions. In 1912, he was working closely with his assistant, Francis Aston. They were analyzing the positive ions of neon gas, channeling a beam of positive neon ions through electric and magnetic fields. Very similar to how Thomson had bent the electron beam years earlier. The beam hit a photographic plate, leaving a mark where the ions landed. If it was all just pure neon gas, they should all land in exactly the same spot, because they are all identical atoms of the same element. That was the classical assumption. But when Thomson and Aston developed the photographic plate, they noticed something that shouldn't be physically possible. The neon ions weren't hitting the plate in a single tight cluster. The beam was splitting. It left two distinct parabolic paths on the photographic plate. A single beam of neon was acting like it was made of two completely different substances, specifically, acting like it had two different masses. The magnetic field bends lighter objects more sharply, while heavier objects have more momentum and take a wider curve. Thomson's equations showed that one stream of neon had an atomic weight of roughly 20, and the second stream took a wider path, indicating an atomic weight of 22. But they were both, undeniably, the element neon. Chemically, they were perfectly identical. Physically, one was heavier than the other. This was the very first definitive evidence that stable elements could exist as isotopes, atoms of the exact same chemical element that possess different physical masses. Today, we know they have different numbers of neutrons in their nucleus, though Thomson didn't know neutrons existed yet. The neutron wouldn't be discovered until 1932 by a man named James Chadwick, who, incredibly fittingly, was a student of Ernest Rutherford, who was a student of J.J. Thomson. To measure these distinct mass paths, Thomson and Aston had essentially invented the prototype for the mass spectrometer. Think about the modern world today, testing a microscopic paint chip in a true crime documentary to match a suspect's car, NASA rovers analyzing the soil composition on Mars, or pharmaceutical companies testing the purity of drugs. All of that relies on mass spectrometry. The most vital analytical tool in modern chemistry was birthed right there, from Thomson staring at two faint smudges on a glass plate. Yet, as we look at his life, the science is only one facet. The man himself was a fascinating study in contrasts. For a man who was literally tearing apart the foundational reality of the universe, his personal life was remarkably grounded and full of hidden dimensions. In 1890, he married Rose Elizabeth Paget. Their relationship is historically significant in its own right. Rose was the daughter of a prominent Cambridge medical professor, but more importantly, she was a pioneer. She was among the very first generation of women permitted to attend advanced university lectures at Cambridge. They met when she was attending Thomson's physics lectures, and she subsequently conducted her own experiments on soap films in the Cavendish laboratory. It was a true intellectual partnership. Beyond the intense world of physics, Thomson cultivated surprisingly diverse passions to decompress. He was a highly enthusiastic amateur botanist, taking intensely long walks into the rugged countryside, obsessively hunting for rare plant specimens. He was also a massive, highly vocal sports fanatic. The man who discovered the electron could be found shouting at the referee from the bleachers. He was a rabid follower of Cambridge rugby and cricket, but his true obsession was the annual Cambridge-Oxford boat races. He didn't just watch them, he analyzed them. People within the university administration would actively seek him out for advice on placing wagers, because he applied the same intense analytical scrutiny to the rowers that he applied to subatomic particles. He studied the water conditions, the mechanical advantage of the oars, and the mass of the crew. He was calculating fluid dynamics on a chalkboard to win a 5-pound bet, doing sports analytics a century before Moneyball. And alongside his sports betting and his botany, he was a deeply devout man. Thomson was a practicing, sincere Anglican throughout his entire life. It was a well-known fact among his peers that despite his immense scientific stature and his radical discoveries, he would kneel by his bed to pray every single night, and he regularly read scripture before retiring. He didn't see his discoveries as breaking religion. He saw the creation as vastly more complex and awe-inspiring than previously thought. He saw absolutely no conflict between exploring the deep mechanics of the universe and revering its creator. But perhaps the most poetic, almost unbelievable aspect of Thomson's legacy isn't about his religious faith, or his botanical walks, or even his own Nobel Prize. The ultimate narrative twist revolves around his bloodline. Rose and JJ had a son together, George Paget Thomson. Growing up in this environment of absolute scientific inquiry, George decided to go into the family business of physics. In 1937, 31 years after his father won the highest honor in science, George Paget Thomson was awarded his own Nobel Prize in physics. It's what George won the prize for that makes this the ultimate, almost Shakespearean irony. J.J. Thomson won the 1906 Nobel Prize for discovering the electron and proving conclusively that it was a physical, tangible particle, a tiny bullet of matter. 30 years later, George won the 1937 Nobel Prize for his elegant experiments involving the diffraction of electrons by crystals. His experiments proved conclusively that the electron can, and does, behave as a wave. It is the ultimate generational rebellion. Imagine the dinner table conversations. Dad, you won a Nobel Prize for telling the world it's a solid particle. I'm going to win a Nobel Prize for telling the world it's a wave. How does a father react to his own son literally proving his defining life's work was only half the story? He was intensely, fiercely proud of his son. But intellectually, the whiplash was profound. J.J. Thomson was a classical physicist down to his bones. He believed in particles. He believed in tangible forces. He believed in mechanical models you could visualize. George's wave discovery was the beating heart of the new, strange, highly counterintuitive world of quantum mechanics. A world where things can be particles and waves at the exact same time, where certainty dissolves into probability. Close friends noted that in his final years, J.J. spent a massive amount of time isolated at his desk, furiously scribbling equations, trying desperately to find a classical mathematical framework to reconcile his son's new wave results with his own rigid particle convictions. The transition from classical certainty to quantum weirdness mapped directly onto the relationship between a father and a son. The father violently breaks the atom to find the particle. The son takes that same particle and proves it's actually a shimmering wave. It perfectly encapsulates the relentless, cumulative, and often contradictory nature of science. J.J. Thomson passed away in 1940 at the age of 83. His immense contributions were recognized by the nation. His ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey, resting right near the graves of Isaac Newton and, incredibly fittingly, his own former student, Ernest Rutherford. He lived long enough to see the classical physical world he helped build be completely revolutionized and overwritten by the very people he trained, mentored, and raised. He didn't just leave behind a textbook discovery. He left behind an entire dynasty of minds that shaped the 20th century, which leaves us with a highly provocative paradox to consider. If we connect everything we've unpacked, the tragedies, the mentorship, the discoveries, J.J. Thomson's greatest strength, the very thing that allowed him to change the world, might actually have been his severe physical clumsiness. Because he physically couldn't build the delicate glass vacuum tubes or meticulously wire the circuits himself, he was forced to step back. He couldn't isolate himself. He had to rely on his assistants. He had to build a collaborative empire, constantly talking, debating, and mentoring the greatest minds of the next generation to physically test his abstract theories for him. Was the birth of modern physics the deeply collaborative, team-based laboratory culture that defines all of big science today, entirely dependent on a brilliant visionary who was just terrible at building things? It is a question worth pondering the next time you feel held back by your own limitations. If you want to keep exploring the hidden dramas behind history's greatest minds, the bitter rivalries, and the wild, tragic accidents that shape our reality, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We rely entirely on curious listeners like you to keep unearthing these incredible stories. Keep questioning the unquestionable, and we'll see you next time.